The year is 2008, and the college landscape looks a lot like it does today. An SEC West team in LSU had just won a national championship, and another SEC team, Georgia, sits atop the preseason polls. The Big 12 is on the outside looking in after failing to send one of its own to the title game the year prior. You see, then Big 12 team Missouri carried the number one ranking into conference championship week, only to get upended by Oklahoma, who had already eliminated itself from BCS title contention. But 2008 was going to be different. Texas and Oklahoma both touted experienced squads, led by Heisman hopefuls Colt McCoy and Sam Bradford respectively. The pieces were in place for both of these top 10 sides to make a run at the title, which ultimately ended up happening, as the Sooners rode the nation's most explosive offense to the BCS championship game in Miami. How they ended up there, though, was thanks to one of the most bizarre and controversial three-way tiebreakers in not only Big 12, but college football history. Today we remember that time when the Big 12 had a mess on their hands. Thanks to a couple of upsets at the top of the polls in prior weeks, including number 1 Georgia being dismantled between the hedges by Alabama, the Red River Rivalry was a top 5 affair, with 5th-ranked Texas locking horns with the number 1 team in the land, the Sooners. As far as big games go, this one was your standard fare top 5 rivalry showdown. Lots of points were scored, there was drama late, and when the dust had settled, the Longhorns and Colt McCoy emerged triumphant, 45-35. 45-35. Remember this score for later. Meanwhile, on the other end of the great state of Texas, another team from the Big 12 South was making noise, as the Red Raiders of Texas Tech had just pushed their record to 6-0 following an overtime win over Nebraska. The race for the Big 12 South was heating up, but no one had any idea how wild things were about to get. Although Texas swaggered into Jones AT&T Stadium with the nation's top ranking, the battle for the governor's spurs was arguably the second most anticipated matchup of the day. All eyes were trained on the cocktail party in Jacksonville to see how Urban Meyer's Gators would respond to last year's end zone stomp courtesy of the Georgia Bulldogs. It didn't hurt that both teams were in the top 10 and had national title aspirations. By the time the afternoon game had ended, the Gators handed the Dogs a 49-10 beatdown, and the national audience wanted the ABC nightcap to be the thriller they so desperately craved. They got their wish. Texas Tech welcomed the Longhorns to Lubbock with a dizzying passing attack. Led by signal caller Graham Harrell and future NFL wideout Michael Crabtree, the Red Raiders were ready to give UT all they could handle. The game came down to the last drive, as all historically great games do, with Tech trailing the Longhorns and needing only a field goal to win. With just seconds left and the ball on the 28-yard line, Harrell accepted the shotgun snap and found Crabtree on the sideline, inside the 10. All Crabtree had to do was spin out of bounds, and Tech could set up for a chip shot field goal for the win. But the Bolitnikoff winner had other plans, and after shaking off one would-be tackler and outrunning another, Michael Crabtree darted across the black-painted end zone, ball carelessly clutched in his hand, giving college football one of the most iconic images of the last decade and a half. Game over. Tech 39, Texas 33. With one wild play deep in the heart of Texas, the Red Raiders were now in the driver's seat in both the Big 12 and national championship discussion. Oklahoma still had something to say about that. By late November, the BCS picture had largely come into focus. While teams like USC still had a fighting chance to make a run at the Crystal Football, it looked like it was going to be the winner of the SEC crown, taking on the Big 12 champ. At this moment in time, that meant Texas Tech, with their undefeated record and number 2 BCS ranking, was in prime position to head to Miami. They had just navigated 3 consecutive wins against ranked opponents, and the only team that could conceivably stand in their way were the Sooners. And so the Red Raiders traveled to Norman for a night game that was easily the most hyped matchup of the weekend. While most teams were playing the last of their cupcake matchups heading into rivalry week, 2 of the hottest offenses in the country were girding up their loins to do battle, making Central Oklahoma the epicenter of the college football universe that day. Unfortunately for the viewers and the good people of Lubbock, Texas, the game was over before halftime. The Sooners and their Heisman front-running quarterback Sam Bradford scored 35 points in the second quarter and rode a wave of momentum to the tune of 42-7 into the home locker. The final score was ugly, OU 65, Tech 21, as Mike Leach and his Red Raiders had been dismantled at their own game. After the clock hit 0, all three teams in the Big 12 South stood with one blemish on their record. Many fans didn't know it at the time, but Texas Tech, through both their triumph over Texas and their embarrassment to Oklahoma, had created an unprecedented conundrum for both their conference and their sport. The last week of the regular season for 2008 had gone pretty much exactly as planned, which was a huge problem. The Big 12 triplets of Tech, Texas, and Oklahoma all won their season finales, which meant the Big 12 had some tough decisions to make in the late hours of November 29th and the wee hours of November 30th. Texas had defeated OU, Tech upended Texas, and OU demolished Tech. This little rock beats scissors beats paper paradox meant that the first handful of tiebreakers determining the Big 12 South divisional champion had been rendered effectively null and void. With all three teams boasting a 7-1 conference record, the next tiebreaker was head-to-head, which was also a moot point, as all three teams had beaten each other. The subsequent tiebreaker involved who had the better divisional record, and, since all three teams had lost to a team from the South Division, this tiebreaker had also been thrown out. This left the much controversial BCS poll to decide the winner of the Big 12 South and effectively choose which team gets to play for a national championship. So while the Big 12 waited with bated breath, the results were being tallied. And the winner of this sordid sweepstakes was, of course, Oklahoma. Seeing as how Tech had the worst and most recent loss of the three teams, they were effectively eliminated almost from the word go. That left Texas and OU to battle it out. Now, if you remember from earlier, Texas had beaten Oklahoma back in October, 45-35. However, since Oklahoma's loss was earlier in the season, and since Oklahoma's win in Stillwater over a top 15 Oklahoma State opponent the night before the polls dropped was far more impressive than Texas's home win over fledgling Texas A&M, the computers gave Oklahoma the nod. The cries from Austin could be heard from coast to coast. How could a team that beat Oklahoma on a neutral field be left to sit on its hands in the first week in December, while the Sooners got the shot to lift the Big 12 championship trophy and be gifted what was essentially a play-in game for the national title? It didn't help that Oklahoma cruised past an overmatched Mizzou squad for the second year in a row, effectively ending Texas's way outside shot at landing in Miami in January. The noise would only get louder in the following weeks, but just how loud it got directly preceding and following the championship game is still something to talk about almost a decade later. Bowl season only served to muddy the decisions of the BCS selection committee even more. Texas Tech faced a 4-loss Ole Miss team in the Cotton Bowl on January 2nd, only to get physically dominated, further proving this was always a two-team race in 2008. Texas, to its credit, took down a very talented Ohio State team in the Fiesta Bowl, while Oklahoma's offense was slowed down considerably by Florida's battle-tested defense. The Sooners would watch the Gators ride a transcendent QB and historically talented defense to a national championship right before their eyes. This raised the question, did Texas deserve to go to the title game in the place of OU? Were the Longhorns robbed? Personally, I don't think so. Oklahoma was almost unfair on offense for the entire second half of the season, hanging 60 points on a handful of highly ranked conference opponents. They also gave Florida everything they could handle, picking Tebow off twice in the first half of the game, something no team had done against the QB in his 2 full years of starting at UF. They were even tied with the Gators heading into the fourth quarter. Oklahoma was more than deserving of their nod for the Big 12 South crown. As far as national aftermath, this wouldn't be the last time a controversial tie in the Big 12 would lead to some backlash. 2014 saw TCU on the outside looking in, thanks to a close loss in October to conference rival Baylor. But this three-way tie was perhaps even more memorable and even more influential in the eventual downfall of the Bowl Championship Series. The BCS had already seen its fair share of controversies in the previous seasons. Auburn in 2004, the Ohio State-Michigan-Florida love triangle of 2006, and the absolute chaos of 2007. But the ball was already rolling for the BCS is busted debate. This only managed to grease the skids some more. Whether anyone wants to admit it or not, The 2008 Big 12 controversy only furthered the discussion of needing a playoff in college football. The BCS was indeed flawed, but without it, we may never have had one of the most memorable kerfuffles in all of college football. I was, admittedly, a fan of the BCS. I can agree it was far from perfect, but some of my fondest memories stem from the BCS era of college football, and 2008 was no different. It was, after all, that time when the Big 12 had a mess on its hands. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. Please leave a like, dislike, or comment about your favorite memories from the 2008 season, or any season, and don't forget to subscribe to your wife's favorite sports show. She'll appreciate it.